Jisei. Thank you, Kojin. Wonderful to see all of you here. I'm looking at the dark windows behind Jisei and conscious of the time changing and the fact that at least here in the Northeast, it's now cold out, actually quite cold, seems unseasonably cold. I see Monica is bundling up. And actually, with the dark days, I guess I could say Happy Diwali. I don't know much about Diwali except that many of the Indian families in our neighborhood have lights all over the place. So they're celebrating the Festival of Lights, which is always kind of a happy event this time of year, I think, for those families. So this evening, actually, my Dharma talk this evening was inspired by a bit of pop culture, which goes to show that a Dharma talk can be inspired by pretty much anything. Sarah and I have been watching a fantasy sitcom recently called The Good Place, which first aired in 2016 and ended in 2020. And I won't reveal any spoilers here, so if you haven't seen it and you like sitcoms, it's on Netflix. But it's actually a very interesting exploration of some principles that arise in Buddhist practice. So just a brief summary of the theme. So the show starts, and there are actually 4 characters who have died and end up in the afterlife. And whether any of them ends up in the good place or the bad place is actually based on a strict mathematical calculation of how many points they accumulated in the course of their human existence. And as it turns out, one of the characters is a professor of moral philosophy who lectures the other 3 on the question, what does it mean to be a good person? So it's a basic premise of the show actually is the accumulation of merit, which is a tenet of Buddhism. The idea that through wholesome or beneficial actions, we accumulate virtue or merit. To understand which actions are beneficial, we have to be conscious of the effects that they have on others. And intention matters. Beneficial actions which are undertaken for self-centered reasons do not have the same merit as beneficial actions that are undertaken selflessly. And in fact, in the rubric of the show, we can even accumulate negative points for beneficial actions that are selfishly undertaken. So it's actually a very interesting little exploration of moral philosophy, which other than my Buddhist practice, I know next to nothing about. But it actually caused me to reflect, and as I've watched it, well, what are we doing here? What's the difference between moral philosophy as taught by Western philosophies and Hollywood writers, and what we're doing here with our practice and with the teachings that we study? So, of course, moral and ethical conduct are an important part of our practice. I think I realized this very early on in my practice, that it's very difficult to have a clear mind and to be at peace with yourself if you're living a self-centered existence. Of course, more formally, we practice with the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. We vow to save all sentient beings. And, if you spend any time with our Sangha, you'll see our vows manifested in many ways, manifested in kindness, manifested in attention, manifested in action in the world. Though in Zen Buddhism, our perspective on morality and the precepts is influenced actually by a particular understanding of reality. So as I was thinking about this question, what does it mean to be a good person? Going beyond sitcom Buddhism, you could say that we practice to see the true nature of reality, which another way of saying that is to see our life as it really is. To experience our reality or our lives directly, moment by moment, without having our experience clouded by our ideas, even being clouded by our ideas of what it means to be a good person. And through that understanding of reality, to cultivate wisdom and compassion. And therefore, through the natural outflowing of our hearts, to be of service in the world. So with this question of we practice this to see the true nature of reality, what do we really mean? We chant every time we chant the Heart Sutra, form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness is no other than form. But what does this mean? And of course, this teaching is based on the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Prajnaparamita translates as the perfection of wisdom, or directly seeing into emptiness. And this teaching of emptiness, it's so easy to get caught by the subtleness of the Prajnaparamita teachings. I do it all the time. So to illustrate what we mean when I say we practice to see the true nature of reality, I wanted to talk about a particular case from the Mumonkan, case 19. Ordinary mind is the way. Joshu once asked Nansen, what is the way? And Nansen answered, ordinary mind is the way. Then should we direct ourselves toward it or not? Asked Joshu. If you try to direct yourself toward it, you go away from it, answered Nansen. Joshu continued, if we do not try, how can we know that it is the way? Nansen replied, the way does not belong to knowing or to not knowing. Knowing is delusion, not knowing is blankness. If you really attain to the way of no doubt, it is like the great void, so vast and boundless. How then can there be any right or wrong in the way? At these words, Joshu was suddenly enlightened. So in this koan, actually, Joshu's a young man, and Nansen is a much older teacher, an awakened master. And we hear a sincere question from this young student. Teacher, what is the way? And Nansen answers, ordinary mind is the way. We could also translate this, ordinary life is the way, or everyday life is the way. We could translate the word way as path. Everyday life is the path. And when I say path, it invokes for me the Eightfold Path, the 8 practices taught by the Buddha that lead to arhatship, or an awakened life, right understanding, right thought, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. When we say the way, it invokes to me a more subtle notion, a Taoist notion of living in tune with the rhythms of our lives. But of course, we also refer to the pathless path in Zen Buddhism to acknowledge that it's not a cookbook, it's not a set of rules, like in the good place that we can follow to end up in the better place instead of the worst place. It's much more difficult and much more subtle than that. So when Nansen hears this question, what is the way? He replies with a very, very simple answer. He says, why, your life is the way. This life in this moment. And so in the very first question and answer, it's all been said. Because of our fundamental illusion of separateness, of course, a separate self, we tend to look for meaning somewhere else. We tend to look for meaning outside of ourselves. Now, where we look depends on our particular cast of mind and our particular circumstances. We might look for it in status or the accumulation of things. If we're younger, we might look for it in sex. We might look for it in career advancement. We might look for it in being a good person. Nansen says, no, son, those are all ideas. It's right here in this moment. But of course, in the koan, Joshu doesn't understand Nansen's meaning. And he asks a very sincere follow-up question. Well, I don't get it. How should I direct myself to gain this insight? And Nansen very kindly replies, if you direct yourself toward it, you go away from it. And in a way, I think it's kind of ironic because we first come to practice because we recognize that despite all of our striving, despite all of our attempts to find whatever it is we're looking for, we can't find it. So we come into practice and we do the same thing. We strive, we compare ourselves to others, we feel inadequate. And eventually, after many years, we begin to realize that all of our spiritual searching and striving are looking for something outside of ourselves, something separate from ourselves, separates us from the way. We already have what we're looking for. But Joshu is very young and he doesn't see it. He's confused. He says, if we don't direct ourselves toward it, how can we know that it's the way? And Nansen, again, is very, very patient. He says, the way does not belong to knowing or to not knowing. Knowing is delusion, not knowing is blankness. If you really attain to the way of no doubt, it is like the great void, so vast and boundless. How then can there be right and wrong in the way? At these words, Joshu is greatly enlightened. How much beyond the story of the good place versus the bad place is this teaching? Reality can't be known. We aren't going to attain some understanding and then be done with practice. Master Dogen taught us that practice and realization are not separate. Practicing itself is realization. In the wholehearted way in Bendoa, Dogen says, all Buddhas together have been simply transmitting wondrous Dharma and actualizing supreme perfect enlightenment, for which there is an unsurpassable, unfabricated, wondrous method. This wondrous Dharma has as its criterion naturally joyous samadhi, which we experience through our zazen. All Buddhas have been simply transmitting wondrous Dharma and actualizing supreme perfect wisdom, for which there is an unsurpassable, unfabricated, wondrous method. This wondrous Dharma has as its criterion naturally joyous samadhi. So the true nature of reality is found in experiencing our lives, in being present. not clouded by our ideas of how our lives should be, not clouded by our ideas of how practice should be, not clouded by our intellectual understanding of Zen, not clouded by our belief of what it is to be a good person or not a good person, just being fully alive and fully present in the moment. As Shakespeare said, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophies. Sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes it's pretty shitty. And whether it's wondrous or shitty, we practice. We practice with our emotions, noticing our delight when it's wonderful, noticing our aversion and our dissatisfaction when it's not. We practice with our thoughts, listening to our self-talk, the voice in our head that tries to explain, to justify, to understand, to fix. There's nothing wrong with that voice in our head. That's what our minds do. They maintain the fiction of a separate self, and the ego writes stories about it. We practice with our bodies. How do I feel this dark, cold evening? Somehow, no matter how many times our teachers say it, we think there's something else to be grasped. With this tendency to grasp, I'm reminded of the story of Deshawn the Tea Woman. Deshawn, of course, was a great scholar of the Diamond Sutra, and he was traveling to meet another teacher, when he stopped at the hut of an old woman. He asked her, "What do you do?" She replied, "I sell rice cakes." He said, "Please sell me some." She asks him, "Well, what will you do with them, Reverend?" He says, "I will eat them to refresh myself." Then she notices his heavy backpack, and she says, "What are you carrying?" And he says, well, I'm a great scholar of the Diamond Sutra. I have my writings and great teachings on the Diamond Sutra in my pack." She says to him, "I was told that the Diamond Sutra says, past mind is ungraspable, present mind is ungraspable, future mind is ungraspable. With which mind will you satisfy your hunger?" And poor Deshawn was unable to answer, so wrapped up in his ideas of the Diamond Sutra that he couldn't answer the old woman's question. How would you answer? How caught we are by our words, by our concepts, by our need for validation, for solid ground. This life can't be grasped, no matter how desperately we want to grasp it. And if we practice long enough, and if we practice consistently, we will eventually get a glimpse of that. How can we grasp the experience of grief, of mourning a child or a husband who died too young? How can we grasp the beauty of the wind blowing the autumn leaves? How can we grasp birth and death? Sarah and I enjoyed so much going to the Jersey Shore this year. In the heat of the summer day, we would be there and the sun would beat down, and diving in the ocean would just be so refreshing. And when we went last week on a cold day in autumn, we were shuffling along the boardwalk, bundled up, just watching the waves. Such a different experience. And the boardwalk was covered with sand, and I would go and pick up a few grains. Have you ever inspected a grain full of sand? They're grains of so many different colors. They're transparent grains, creamy white grains, gold grains, black grains. From a distance, it looks like a single color, but up close, there's so many colors. If you really attain to the way of no doubt, it is like the great void, vast and boundless. How can there be any right or wrong in the way? The teachings try to cut off our desire to find it. Any attempt we make to pin down reality, to encase it in amber, they can't capture it. Realizing this, we can be alive, fully alive. We can live with an open heart. You might even say we're in the good place. And being in that place of being alive and being open to reality, wisdom and compassion come naturally. Being of service comes naturally. Not of some sort of an artificial standard that we aim for, not as some set of things that we have to do to be a good people, just as an outflowing of our life in this moment. I'll end with a gatha. Sitting here in this Buddha field, it's a good place, rain or shine. Being present with each moment. My mind is clear and my heart is open.